Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Monday. I believe it is March 21st, first day of spring. And I just wanted to remind you guys that we do have some things coming up. The research project introduction is due, and also we have our third quiz, which is up online for you guys. So, without further ado, let me get into research design. This presentation is basically going to cover the various designs of research and give you an idea as you write your methods section for your project what research design might be best for you. We're also going to talk a little bit about sampling and how to go about sampling, what the positives and negatives are of each sampling method, and we're going to finish with some ethical questions related to research design. So first of all, how do we find the right design? Two questions you need to ask yourself. The first is, what do I need to answer my question? And again, I think that is, it's quite a vague question, but it really speaks to what kinds of resources, what kinds of facilities do you need, but also what would be the best design to use so that I could get data that would be most valuable. And again, in a couple of slides, we'll be talking about those designs. And the second question is, what's the best way to collect my data? And that also speaks to what I was just talking about, which is going to be on the next slide. We're going to start with looking at the various types of designs. The first one, which I think is probably the most common, and is known as an experimental research design. And this is where independent and dependent variables, such as in a treatment study, are used to demonstrate a cause. So what we do is we look at we look at a dependent variable, let's say like heart rate, and we look to see whether or not there is a change in heart rate due to a particular intervention that we put into the study, or a particular treatment if we're talking about a drug. In this case, we see that there is covariation, and that means that there's variables that kind of work together. So we may not only be looking at one dependent variable, we may be looking at a few. Maybe we're looking at heart rate and blood pressure. The independent variable in this case might be intensity of exercise. And we really want to see, through an experimental design, does the intervention or the medicine or whatever it is that we are implementing, does that change the dependent variables in any way? And we kind of look at it over time. So there is a time order. And that time order is usually, in this case, short. It's usually not months on end. It's probably days or weeks or even hours, depending upon what it is that we're using as our intervention. This is also non-spuriousness, and what that means is when we say something spurious, we mean it's kind of thin. It doesn't have a lot of theory behind it. In this case, what we want to do is we want to ground our experiment in theory so that we do have a hypothesis that is somewhat substantiated by people who have come before us. And as I said before, I think experimental design is probably the most common that you'll see. The second one is a cross-sectional design, and actually this is often used with surveys and questionnaires. But what's important to understand about a cross-sectional design versus an experimental design is that a cross-sectional design is just a snapshot in time. Basically, you're looking at the effect of something on a particular population, but at that moment. You're not looking at the effect of something on a population that's related to an intervention necessarily. So you might look at the differences of aerobic performance by gender. So we look at males and females. We look at the differences in aerobic performance at a moment in time, and then we report on it. Almost like a descriptive type study, it gives us a window into what that population is acting like and what the characteristics of that population are. So in terms of a positive way, you get a lot of information about a particular population or a cross-sectional group. in a negative way, it's not a prospective study in the sense that you are not measuring the effect of anything. So again, you're reporting on it similar to a descriptive study. And again, and I think that a cross-sectional study can lead to a more experimental design type study. But in the case of, in the case of using a cross-sectional study to really do some kind of prospective data analysis, that's not what you would choose. So if you want to take a look at a population and describe them, cross-sectional is the way to go. If you want to look at the effect of an intervention on a specific dependent variable, then experimental is the way to go. Third is a time series, and this is similar to experimental. What you're doing is you're looking at the pre and post values of the dependent variable in response to the independent variables. So again, you're looking at heart rate and blood pressure and the change over time, but now what you've got is you've got a pre and post. It's a little bit different. In the case of let me kind of decipher that for you. In the case of the experimental design, you're really looking at kind of one group, one variable. So in group A, it looks like heart rate changed when I implemented that intervention. That's my experimental design. However, in the time series, I want to look at not only group A, but I want to look at group A and group B. So maybe group A gets the experiment, they get the special program, the intervention, or the medicine, and group B does not get that. So now I have a control for the effects that I'm seeing in group A. And this is one of the ways to really tightly design a study, because when you control for the effect, now you can say a lot more about what kind of differences you see in the variable. Let me give you a for instance. Okay, so you have a specific medicine and you're giving it to group A, and you want to see that medicine's effect on heart rate in group A. And in group B, you don't give the medicine, but you give what's known as a placebo. It looks like the medicine, smells like the medicine, tastes like the medicine, but it's not the medicine. It's a sugar pill. And basically you want to see, let's say, if heart rate is elevated due to this medicine. So in the experimental group, you give the actual medication, and in group B, you give a placebo. And then you want to see what changes are there in heart rate. Well, this is a really nice way of controlling for that effect of the medication. And it's done all the time. It's done in a lot of different sports science and social science type research. And like I said before, it gives a lot of power to the effect that you see in your variable because you're controlling for that effect. So it's a really nice way to design a study. So as far as the positives, it's a great way to design a study. As far as the negatives, there's a couple of things here. One is that, especially when it comes to medication, there are a lot of different hoops to jump through to get these kinds of studies approved by review boards. And the reason is because if individuals possibly need the medication, then you're withholding medication, and that can be looked at as being somewhat unethical. However, in order to determine whether or not the medication has any effect, you definitely need a control group against that effect. So I think the positives here is it's a really nice study design, and it gives you a lot of reason to say and kind of substantiate the claim that your medication works or your intervention works. And the negative is that it could be thought of withholding medication if you're using a placebo. It could be thought as deception if you're using a placebo. And you also need more people involved in your study. See, in the experimental group, the experimental design, you could have one group of 25 people, and then you look and see what the effect is of the particular intervention on those 25 people. But in the time series, you're going to need double that, because you need 25 people in group A and 25 people in group B, which means that recruitment makes it a little bit harder. So again, I think that that's a little bit of a negative there. However, this type of study is considered prospective because you're looking forward in time. And like I said, I think that, it's a nice way to design a study. The last one is a longitudinal study, and similar to a time series study, it uses time, but in a longitudinal study, it's usually over a longer period of time. Could be months, could be years. Often you use this kind of study if you're looking at, let's say, the effect of pollution on a particular population in a geographic location over the last 10 years. So you're doing a longitudinal study. Now, these studies are mostly prospective in the sense that you basically say, over the next 25 years, I'm going to be looking at the effect of this independent variable on these various dependent variables in this population, or not often, but it could be retroactive too, or retrospective, in that you look back at data over a long period of time. But usually longitudinal analysis is done prospectively. And let's talk about the positives and negatives. Well, the positive is that once you get your data over a long period of time, it's very hard to refute that data. That's some very strong information, especially if it's collected over months or years. The negative is it's collected over months or years. So it takes a long time to get this data, and the longer you collect the data, the more the probability, or I should say the higher the likelihood of people dropping out of the study. A perfect example is the study that is being done by the National Cancer Institutes, which I believe are part of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and they're doing a longitudinal study on cancer. And they are, utilizing all demographics, races, genders, it doesn't matter. And basically, they send you a questionnaire I think it's every 2 years, and you fill out that questionnaire, and you send it back to them. And what they're doing is they're going through the data, and they're looking over a very long period of time based on fitness level, based on BMI, based on gender, based on race, based on all of geographic location where you live. What is the chance of you actually being diagnosed with cancer? So, and it was something I didn't start it, but it was something that I actually got involved in at LIU. So I decided I would be part of the study. And over the last, I'd say 2 years, I've gotten, I got a survey here in Arizona, was sent to me. So I filled it out and sent it in. And I'm sure I'll get another one in another 2 years. So every 2 years, they're kind of updating their database. That's a pretty amazing undertaking, as you can imagine. It doesn't only take a long time, it takes a lot of people, tremendous amount of resources, and a lot of effort. So I think that those are some of the negatives of longitudinal design. Now, when it comes to looking at three other research designs. The first one I want to call your attention to is a case study. And case studies are often they're often ways of looking at a particular phenomena or a particular kind of unlikely occurrence in an industry, in an area, in a discipline. Often in medicine, we see case studies, right? Here's a diagnosis of something we've never actually seen before. Perfect example is if you are following any of the information on the incidence of concussion in pro football. It started in the 1950s with a forensic neuropathologist from Nigeria who, and again, he's in the movie Concussion, although I didn't see that movie. I read the book it's based on. And basically, he found a new diagnosis called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, which is what a lot of the football players' brains are found to have now. And it's what, kind of is associated with dementia and forgetfulness and cognition, decrease in cognition and all of that. But that's besides the point. The idea is that when he first found it, that was a case study. And the case study was the center for the Pittsburgh Steelers at the time, Mike Webster, who had been playing football basically his entire life. He was the first guy within which they found CTE. He was the case study. He was the unlikely occurrence in medicine, and they used his information, his data, to then obviously blow this up and look at several other brains and come up with theories and all of that. So Gall in 1996 basically listed 4 things that make up what would be case study design. And the first is phenomena that can be studied. And in the case of CTE, it provides a perfect example. The second is an in-depth study. So when you read a case study, you are reading a very, very detailed explanation of what was found. There's nothing vague about it, and there's really no when researchers write a case study, the idea is that they want to bring to the scientific literature a very, very detailed account of what they found. There's true transparency in a case study. Also, often case studies are found in a natural context. So you're not necessarily going to do a lab test on 20 people and write a case study. That's not what happens. However, as I mentioned, the Nigerian pathologist who was doing his autopsy looked at the brain, sliced it open, and found this crazy thing in the brain, these crazy tangles in the brain that had never been seen before, and that was done in a natural context. So that's usually where these case studies are found, and often it does not involve the perspective of the researcher. For instance, if you do a lab study and you are, testing your participants, they obviously know they're being tested. They obviously know they're in a study. They know that. In a case study, that's often not the case. You don't necessarily tell the individual that you're doing a case study. Obviously, you report on it, and afterwards you get your approvals that you need. But usually it's a diagnosis that, is something that is so unlikely, and then you think to yourself, wait a minute, this would be a really great addition to the scientific literature, and then you write your case study. So you really don't have a perspective of the researcher involved in that. Another research design is known as grounded theory, and this is associated with the inductive approach, not deductive approach. So it's not like you're deducing something like a detective, but it's more the inductive approach where you're utilizing theory to kind of almost substantiate your data. So you're getting initial data, and then from there you're utilizing theories to substantiate it. The problem is that often, as similar to a longitudinal study, this is a risky and a long-term investment. And again, for individuals who study in the social sciences, many of those studies are long-term because you want to see the effect on a population over time. But it's risky, and again, risky for the same reasons a longitudinal study is risky, because dropout rates increase over time, recruitment is difficult, and those reasons I think kind of point to the negatives of this type of study design. Ethnography is a little bit different in that it is the study of the culture of a population. So what ends up happening is the researcher immerses himself or herself into the population to find out as much as they possibly can. In this case, the data is flexible in that you don't necessarily have this kind of structured procedure that you have to follow that you find in a lot of the sports science type research. But also, there are staggered time points here. It's not like a linear sequence of time in which you're measuring information. You get these staggered time points. So there may be some time points during your research intervention that are very, very robust in data, and there may be time points that you're not getting any data at all. So it's important to understand that there are also some risks involved there. And the other thing is, if you think about it, when you are immersing yourself into a population, that's pretty much your life. So you have to really want to make a tremendous commitment and effort in order to get involved with an ethnographical type of research design. Okay, let's talk a little bit about sampling, and these are various ways of sampling that we're going to discuss. The first thing I'd like to talk about is quantitative sampling. So again, we know quantitative to be related to numbers when it comes to our research, and this is studying a small subset to represent a larger population or group. So the first thing we do is we select the sample, okay? We have to define the group. The group could be, they could be professional cyclists, they could be people with heart disease, they could be type 2 diabetics, they could be obese children. We have to define the group. And then once we define the group, we have to decide how is it that we're going to choose our participants. So let's talk about what that means. Well, okay, so let's say, for instance, I'm going to define a group of, we'll say Obese children, right? Okay, so I'm looking at a BMI over 35. So what I'm going to do is basically I'm doing an intervention. I'm doing a test on obese children to find out whether or not this test results in weight loss over the course of 6 months. And I'm going to randomly select individuals to either get the intervention or just to get education on the importance of exercise. So it's an exercise intervention. Either you're going to do the actual intervention over 6 months, or you're going to get information on exercise in a pamphlet, let's say. And so the first way that I could do it is I could randomize, right? Meaning I could go to my group of children who have a BMI over 35, and I can basically randomly select. Randomly can be done picking out of a hat, which is a very kind of rudimentary way of doing it, or it can be done by computer with a software program that randomly samples numbers. And basically, every person in that group has the same likelihood of going into group A or group B. So I'm going to randomly select. And that's probably one of the best ways of doing it, because then I have no bias and I have no control over who goes into what group. Or I could do what's called a stratified random sampling, which means that, let's say, for instance, I say, okay, they have to be over BMI of 35. Well, I have 35 to 38 and 38 to 41 and 41 to 43. Well, I could take those three groups, and within those groups, I can then randomly select. So I could take the people inside the group and randomly select them, but keeping them in that stratified group. That's a possibility. Or I could do what's kind of considered the opposite, which is a cluster. Excuse me. A cluster sampling, which is what I do, is I take the groups themselves and I randomly place them into the different the experimental side or the control side, let's say, the side that's getting the intervention and the side that's getting the pamphlet. So clustering is also a possibility. Or I could do what's called a systematic sampling, which means I take every fourth participant or every fifth participant all the way down the line. And those are the people that go into group A, and then the other people go into group B. So there's a lot of different ways of doing it. Random sampling is considered to be the one that provides the least amount of bias, and the one that probably is, I would say, the most kind of the most coveted way of doing a research design or sampling within your research design. So if you have a random sample, it's highly regarded. It's looked at very, very favorably. Okay, if we qualitatively, so remember this was quantitative using numbers, and if we use qualitative sampling, there are various ways of doing this. So let's talk about some of them. Instead of called sampling, like you would find in a quantitative study, this is known as selection. And let's talk about how we do that. There's various ways of doing it. The first is known as a snowball. And that basically means that you get one person. So for instance, let's say, okay, so you are doing a study on a group of people with Parkinson's disease. Whatever the intervention is, it doesn't really matter. And you find a support group in Brooklyn that that really advocates for people with Parkinson's. They have different kind of support groups during the week. They have various types of events they go to, social, and all of that. And basically, you find the person who's the gatekeeper, the person who's either the director or the manager or whatever of these groups, and that person then becomes your conduit. So you tell them about the study, and then they tell two friends, and they tell two friends, and they tell two friends, and this inside person refers your study to the rest of the sample. So that is known as a snowball. It's known as snowball selection because it gets larger and larger as they give the information to more people. Okay. There's also theoretical selection. And these are cases that are specific to your research, meaning that they're based on the theory of your research. You're looking for cases that are perfectly aligned with your research. That's a little bit obviously selection bias. It will get you the participants that are very much aligned with what you're doing, but finding them is not going to be that easy, right? So theoretical selection, may be a little difficult. There's purposive sampling, which you're looking for specific participants. So not related just to the theory specific to your research, but now you're relating this to specific participants. And I don't just mean people with Parkinson's. It's got to be specifically the participant that would make your sample absolutely pure. So that nothing within your sample is different than anything you're looking at in your research. Again, that's kind of very difficult to find those individuals. Maximum variation sampling is you take the full range of experiences. So the demographics, considering age and gender and race and height and weight and all of that information, you take kind of everybody. Which is also kind of an opportunistic selection method as well. But in maximum variation, you're taking the maximum variation of characteristics. Typical cases, similar to theoretical, but you're taking cases that are specific to a theory. So it may not be your theory, but it's a theory that you're kind of looking into. Could be a theory that was defined 15 years ago, but you're looking for specific cases that speak directly to that theory. Again, difficult to find a large number of people. In extreme cases, you're looking for, again, that theory, but these are extreme cases of the theory, not necessarily moderate or mild cases of the theory. All having to do with qualitative data collection. If you're looking for extreme cases, great. If you find them, hey, more power to you. But if you're really, if you're using that kind of selection, sampling method or selection method, I should say, then you're going to find yourself really, doing a lot of legwork to get these extreme cases within a particular theory. Now, you could obviously use mentors, you could use resources, you can contact authors, you could do all of that and try to find those extreme cases, but again, I think it would take a lot of legwork. Opportunistic is known as all comers. That means take everybody as they come. There is no characteristic or there's no kind of quality that would disqualify individuals. You just take everybody. So, for instance, if you were looking at the effect of, let's see, you were looking at the decreased police presence in the New York City subways and its effect on the purchasing of monthly Metro cards. Okay, I'm just throwing this out there. You would take everybody. You would basically wait at the top of a subway stairwell, and you would basically ask people, hey, do you have 2 minutes to fill out a questionnaire? And you would take every single person. There wouldn't be anybody who, would not qualify for that kind of qualitative information. Now, if you were looking for specific cases or specific participants, then okay, then you would, whoever those participants would be, you would basically disqualify some people and qualify others. But in the case of opportunistic selection methods, then you're taking everybody. Now, a sampling or selection of convenience. This is an interesting one, and it's often used, especially in cross-sectional design. I was actually guilty of it. I don't know if I should admit guilt for it, but I actually used it. And the reason is because many years ago I worked in a clinic that had a large population of HIV-positive patients. And because my research was focused on HIV-positive patients, I basically stayed in my clinic to do my research. There was no reason for me to go outside to look for HIV-positive patients unless I was looking for very fit and young HIV-positive patients, because the people who were in our clinic were actually quite sick, and I would say the average age was probably 50 plus. So I had no reason to go outside my clinic. That was known as a sample or selection of convenience. Again, I was a student at the time, I was working full time, so it would have been very difficult for me to kind of go outside of the walls of the clinic that I was working in and try to get a sample. So location, location, location is important in that sense. And then the last one is the selection method of a key informant. And this is, it's similar to the snowball in the sense that you have a gatekeeper, sort of. But this is a key informant who has specific knowledge of participants, whether it be in a particular group, an organization, an industry, whatever. They're able to point you in the direction to get specific participants for your qualitative analysis. So these are various ways of selecting subject pools or participant pools for qualitative studies. What are some of the pitfalls of sampling? Well, first of all, selecting people known to the researcher can actually be kind of a pitfall in the sense that it could develop into a bias without either person knowing. Number one, if the person you select is known by you, then they might want to do something that's going to positively reflect on you. Number two, if you know the participant, you may not treat them the same way as a participant you don't know. So again, that could lead to bias. It could lead to, maybe even some unethical, an unethical course of action in the study that would just kind of taint your data, and it's not worth it. Another pitfall is selecting those who volunteer willingly. Here's an interesting thing that I want to tell you a little bit about. There are people who are career participants, meaning that's how they make their money. They go online, they go in the newspaper, they read about studies that are being done in large academic institutions, and obviously they get paid. They may have to stay in the institution for 6 months and take a certain diet or do a certain exercise program or be poked and prodded with needles and biopsies, but they do it. And they make, they can make a decent amount of money doing it. They obviously get full room and board and meals and everything else. And so they willingly are volunteering for the study. Now, that does not necessarily mean that large academic institutions who are advertising their research don't want people who would willingly do it. Obviously, they're not going to go out on the street and pull people into the building and keep them, against their will. But you do have to be careful of that because these are opportunistic individuals who what they want to do is they want to be poked and prodded in research so that they can make some cash. It's important that you understand that the volunteering should be volunteering. It should be, I'm kind of interested in helping out. I'm going to do this research study. Now, if the money being paid is a coercion to volunteer, fine. I guess it works. Obviously, if you're getting paid thousands of dollars and you feel like, that's going to help you along, then great. Then spend 6 months in a hospital getting poked and prodded. But you need to be very careful of how that's done. Also, there cannot be coercion, meaning you can't say to somebody, you really need to participate in my research study because if you don't, I'm going to fail you. That doesn't work. That's completely unethical. So you really need to be careful with how people are recruited and how they get into the study. And that's definitely a pitfall of sampling when it comes to a lot of researchers and a lot of study designs. Non-random sampling bias. This is selection bias, and we saw it in some of the other methods that we just went over. Non-random sampling bias. If I go to a particular group of people and don't randomly select those individuals to be part of Group A or Group B or however many groups I have, I am not randomly sampling. I'm not randomly selecting. Therefore, I'm selecting for the particular group. Let me give you a for instance, okay? I'm doing a strength training study, and I'm looking at the effect of, let's say, a particular supplement on strength training. Okay, and I have a bunch of people. I have, let's say, 25 people who are very fit, have strength trained before, and I have a bunch of people who have never strength trained in the past. Okay, so obviously the people who have strength trained before are going to have a lower ceiling, right? They're closer to the ceiling because they've been training more. But the training adaptation that I would see to be the greatest would be in the people who never strength trained before. So I'm going to select and take the people who never strength trained before and put them in my strength training group. And then I'm going to select the people who have strength trained before and put them in my exercise pamphlet group where I educate them on the importance of strength training. Where do you think I'm going to see the greatest change? So that selection bias, and it happens, quite often, but that selection bias really is not only unethical, but it basically says that your data is a bunch of BS because what you did was you selected for the group. A non-random sampling bias is something that you really need to be aware of, and when you're reading your research, you got to look at how was this study designed, and if it's a non-random sampling bias, you have to question the results. Using the wrong sampling method. So instead of using a convenience selection method, I'm using a snowball method. Or instead of using a longitudinal study, not a longitudinal study, I'm sorry. Instead of using a purposive type of selection bias, I'm using a random sampling bias or a random sampling method. So again, whether it be quantitative or qualitative, if you don't use the right sampling method for your population or for your participants, it can really screw up your data in the end. So that's kind of what I was going for there. Sorry if that was a little bit confusing. Didn't mean that. Okay. Other sampling pitfalls are small sample size. And this one, I'd say, is probably the most common. Most of the research you read in the literature will list small sampling size as a limitation. And let me give you an example. A lot of the stuff that you read in sports science, especially in the real high-end journals like Medicine, Science, and Sports and Exercise, you'll read that, altitude training in elite cyclists has a significant effect on hemoglobin levels and performance. And then you look at the study and they studied 8 cyclists. And you say to yourself, okay, this is pretty cool. I get it. I get the altitude training and I get the effect on hemoglobin and oxygenation. And that's wonderful. You studied 8 people. And the reason is because only 8 cyclists were able to exercise at that kind of altitude, at 15,000 feet or whatever it is. You have to question that, are 8 cyclists actually representative of the population of elite cyclists? I don't know. Maybe. It depends on how many elite cyclists could actually do that. Small sample size is really, it's a very, very common limitation. And it's a common limitation in anything. Social sciences, psychology, studies, exercise science studies, even basic science studies. So small sample size is something to look out for. And the authors will often say limitation is small sample size, but that doesn't preclude the fact that there was still a small sample size. So it's definitely a pitfall that you need to look out for. How do we determine sample size? This is an interesting one because the rule of thumb is if you have 15 people in each of your groups, your experimental group and your control group, or however many groups you have, usually that's the rule of thumb and you're safe. And you can kind of gain statistical significance based on those numbers. However, that's not necessarily always the case. It really depends on what you're studying and how you're doing it. So try not to make the error of using a percentage of a smaller population, like, we're going to use, of this population of 400 people, we're using 10%, which is 40 people. It's not really a good way to go about it. I'm going to show you exactly how and what are the components to determining sample size. So using a percentage of a larger population, not a great idea. And also, don't assume your sample is a representation of a larger population. As I mentioned before, 8 elite cyclists don't necessarily represent the other elite cyclists in the world that didn't do the study. So we have to be careful of that. As you get more participants in the sample, however, you do reduce the standard deviation, which is nice, because then you tighten the confidence interval, which means the confidence that you think your hypothesis is proving the null hypothesis. So remember, the null hypothesis is basically saying that what you are expecting is not going to happen, And if you disprove, if you reject the null hypothesis, then your study is showing, hey, wow, there's really an effect here. The more participants you get, the higher the power of that study, and the more confident you are to reject the null hypothesis. So this 95% confidence interval is what is often used as the standard, in the sense that I'm 95% sure that the effects of my intervention, my strength training program, my medicine, whatever it is that you are utilizing, the effect of that is 95% due to the intervention. So in other words, the change in the dependent variable, whether it be heart rate, blood pressure, body fat, body weight, the change in that particular dependent variable is 95% due to the intervention, to the medicine, to the strength training program, to the diet, whatever. 5% of that change is due to chance. And most statistics and most research literature utilizes that standard of 95% as the standard you're going for. So if you're only 90% sure that it's due to the intervention and 10% sure that it's due to chance, often that's not considered necessarily statistically significant. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so how do you really figure out a sample size? Well, you conduct what's called a power analysis, and it's a statistical formula that allows you to determine how many people do I need in each group in order to say that this data is not only true, but that it has a statistical significance. So let's take a look at this flowchart and determine what we use, what components we use to determine sample size. The first one is known as the signal. And this is the effect size of the scientific interest. Meaning, if I have a low effect size, it's kind of like 20 to 40% of the change, or I should say 20 to 40% of the change in the dependent variable is sort of due to the intervention, but it has an effect that would be considered low, meaning my results are really not going to have a major impact on the population that I studied. If I have a medium effect size, I'm probably talking about 40 to 60%, where the impact of my study results, is going to be greater. But if I have a large effect size, which is somewhere around, and again, it could range depending, could be around 50 to 80, that's going to have a massive effect size. Now, the problem is with effect size, if I am hypothesizing that the effect size is going to be large, that means that I need to have more people in my study, and also the change in the dependent variable compared to the independent variable needs to be much more robust. It needs to be much greater, much more significant. If I have a medium effect size, I don't necessarily need as many people in my group, plus the effect, again, on the dependent variable is not going to be as large. It's not going to be as great. It's not going to be as significant. If I have a low effect size, I have even less people in my group, and therefore the effect on the dependent variable is much more minimized. Now, you could say that you're going for a low effect size, but when you're going for a low effect size, that's kind of, it's kind of low-hanging fruit. Most people shoot for a medium effect size because it's obviously between the low and the high, but you also need a fairly substantial amount of people in your group, and you need to find that those effects are somewhat, impactful and significant. So we have signal, and that is the effect size, but then we also have noise. And noise is the variability of the experimental material. When we're talking about the experimental material, we're talking about, number one, what's been done in the past and what kind of variability have they seen in the dependent variable as it acts on the independent variable, and what other variables are there, what kind of variables are there in your study? What kinds of things could go wrong? Is there a difference in height and weight that could change the effect of the intervention? Is there a difference in age that could change the effect of the intervention? How about the equipment that's being used? How about the way the equipment's measuring the data? All of that's considered noise. How about the software program you're using for your experiment is has a lot of noise to it. So you kind of have to go in and you have to manually pick out the data. That's also noise. So all of that variability has to be related to the actual signal. So if the signal, the effect size, is set by you and there's a greater amount of noise, what's going to happen? That effect size is actually going to be a lot lower. However, if your signal is a medium effect size, your signal, you choose to have a medium effect and you have hardly any noise, wow, then maybe you have a great effect. Maybe the significance of your study or your data is much, much larger. And therefore, you're not going to need as many people. The less noise you have, the less people you need in your group. The more noise you have, the more people you need in your group, because that variability has to be balanced out over a huge population, as opposed to no noise. Then, if there's really no noise, then a small group should do it. So signal and noise are two major components of what make up the prediction of a sample size. Now, the third, the fourth, and the fifth one have to really do with how you set how important you think the research is. The first one is known as power. It's also known as magnitude. How powerful do you think this study is? Meaning, not how powerful do you think it is when it will get to the general population and its impact, but that's more effect size in terms of its impact on the population you study and on the population at large as you kind of publish your research. But the power has to do with how significant do you think the differences will be. So a power of 80 is what most researchers look for. And a power of 80 says that there is going to be a significant impact of this particular intervention on my research group, on my population. If you have a power of 40, it says that the magnitude is not that great. And it also speaks to the significance level, which is also known as the alpha. The alpha basically says, here's the percentage of the effect that's due to chance, and here's the percentage of the effect that is due to my intervention. Now, power and significance level kind of work hand in hand. A lowly powered study, or a minimally powered study with a very, very high significance doesn't say much, because you didn't when we talk about power, we're primarily talking about the number of participants in the study. The more the number of participants in the study, the higher the magnitude, the higher the power of the study. If you power the study low, so you have less participants in the study, and let's say you don't even have a high signal to noise ratio, so your noise is very low, but you have low power in the study, a significant effect, meaning most of the intervention was due, most of the effect was due to the intervention and not the chance. Let's say, for instance, your significance level is 0.05, which is what researchers look for, but your power is low, it's not going to say much about your data. However, in another sense, if your study is powered at an 80, so now you have a large population, you have different groups, maybe even have a little bit more noise, which is fine, but the groups, the variability within the groups kind of wipes out that noise. It dulls that noise. Your power set at 80 and your significance level 0.05, and you find that your effect, the effect on the dependent variable due to the intervention, is quite significant. With a power of 80, it says a tremendous amount about your data. It says that your data is truly the result of your intervention. Whereas when it's lowly powered, you could argue that the sample size is so small there's hardly any power here. It doesn't really say much about your data. So power and significance level are very, very important when we're discussing the effect of a population, the effect of an intervention, and the size of the study, the impact of the study. Power is self-selected, signal is self-selected, and significance level is self-selected. If you wanted to, you could select a power of 40. If you wanted to, you could select a significance level of 0.10. So you could do that. But noise is not self-selected. That is the variability that you find in your experiment. So if you have a lot of noise, you can have a tremendous amount of power, a lot of significance, and your signal could be, let's say, medium effect size, so not a huge signal. Tremendous amount of noise is going to wipe out your data. So try to keep the noise down. That means the variability needs to be minimized. And what's important about this statement is that in order to minimize the variability, if you do the right research design, the correct sampling method, you have the correct procedure and you follow it to a T step by step, because that's what research is. It is basically baking a cake with several ingredients. If you do the procedure in the right way, your noise is probably going to be minimized, and therefore, with decent amount of signal, no noise, your power is going to be high and your significance level is probably going to be either at 0.05 or below that, which would say that it would say something about your data and about the way you do your research. Now, you can also have an alternative hypothesis, which means instead of rejecting the null hypothesis, you're now going to accept the null hypothesis, and that can also mess up your sample size or obviously influence it. But that, number 5, doesn't often happen. It's really 1, 2, 3, and 4 that are the primary movers of sample size. So again, it's signal to noise ratio, and it's the power that you set, the magnitude or how powerful you think the study is, and also the significance level, being how much you think that the results are due to chance and how much you think the results are due to the intervention. I know that's a lot to swallow. Please rewind that. If you have any questions about that, feel free to send me an email. Case studies and ethnographic sampling, we need to ask the questions, how many cases are there? So is it just one case or is it several? Is the case I'm studying typical or extreme? Remember, ethnographic sampling is immersing yourself into a culture. Case study is basically a one-shot deal, or sometimes it could be 2, even 3, but it's usually 1 to 5 is usually a case study. And you have to decide, the number of cases, are the number of cases that I'm studying worth it? And also, are they typical cases or are they extreme cases? Often when you get a case study of one patient or one clinical situation, it's usually that one and not many more. And also, can I get access to the cases? So if you're looking at something, if you're a doctor and you're working in a clinic, then obviously that patient is your case and you have access. But if you're a researcher coming in from the outside, sometimes access can be very difficult. And especially in ethnographic sampling, when you immerse yourself in a culture, you might think that it's easier because you're involved in the culture and with the people you're studying, but getting access to specific cases might be somewhat difficult. So those are important questions to ask. In terms of non-response bias, this is known as identifying the people who fall into a non-response category. So what does that mean? It's kind of, you run your study, and then there are always going to be people who just don't respond to your intervention. They don't see the same effect as, let's say, the experimental group. But these are not people in the control group. These are people who you're experimenting on and for whom the intervention has been designed, but they don't seem to respond. So what do? We look at sample characteristics with those of the population being studied. So what are the sample characteristics of those people who didn't respond with the population who have been studied? Now, this could be done in a quantitative manner, or it could be done in a qualitative manner. So in a quantitative manner, the non-response category is usually data that you just say, there was just no response to the intervention. That's okay. I mean, it's data that you report. You can look at the characteristics of those individuals who didn't respond, and then you kind of compare them to the people who did or to the population at large. You can do that in a quantitative manner. But in a qualitative study, non-response bias basically means that these people didn't respond to a questionnaire or a survey. Obviously, we get bombarded with surveys constantly. So there is a non-response bias. Now, what do? Do you say, well, the study wasn't good or the survey wasn't good? No, you have to report the data as it comes in. So what can you do? You could send a follow-up letter, you can send a follow-up email to remind people to respond. If that doesn't work, then often they are then listed as non-responders and it goes into your data pool, just like the data from the people who did respond. So what are some methods to collect qualitative data? We talked about these before. We have surveys, which can be online or in person. Questionnaires, again, can be online or in person. Observations can be made. Observations of behavior, observations of built environments, observations of physical plants, meaning like of physical structures and things of that nature. A lot of different ways of getting qualitative data in that sense. Participant observation or attendance, and also content analysis. So what is the content of the study? Analyzing the content for specific components and items is another way to collect qualitative data. The important thing here, and I have the word triangulate with an exclamation point, the important thing is that you need to get data from various sources. So or you need to get your information from various sources. So the first one is collect the data, right? Get the data in a qualitative study and go through it, whether you're using scales, questionnaires, surveys, whatever. The second one is investigator. And what that means is take a look back at investigators who have studied your theory or your discipline in the past. We've talked about this before. Look at what they found. Look at kind of even contact them, but try to. It's almost like you're proving that the way you're doing it is correct because it's been done before that way. So use the investigators that came before you and use the theory that came before you so that you can kind of substantiate and really qualify and confirm the way you're doing your research. So triangulation is from the point of data, from the point of previous investigators, and also from the point of previous theories. And if you can do that, then you really have strong confirmation that the qualitative data you're collecting is correct and accurate. Okay, we're going to finish up with ethical considerations. We may talk a little bit more about this, but there is informed consent, which is extremely important. And as we know, research that we do in the social sciences and the sports sciences should be voluntary. Not the research itself, the participation should be voluntary, and the withdrawal can be voluntary as well. So if somebody at some point, even 6 weeks into your study, says, I don't feel right about doing this research anymore and wants to withdraw, then that is fine. No questions asked, they can do that. Also, if you want to withdraw them as the researcher from the research intervention, that's also allowed. So you can do that as well. Another ethical consideration is deception. So again, if I am doing a placebo-controlled study, but I tell people that what they're getting is the medicine and they're getting placebo, that's a little bit of deception. If I say I'm not going to collect X information from you and I do collect it and publish it, that's deception. So all of those things, if I'm doing something in my research that I told them I wasn't going to do, I'm deceiving them. And that's not something we really look for in research. However, placebo-controlled studies are in and of themselves somewhat deception. However, it's controlled deception and it's accepted deception, because in order to determine whether or not the intervention or medication works, the placebo is one of the best ways in order to do that. The third is confidentiality, and everything that we do in research must be confidential and private, especially with laws related to the Health Information Privacy and Portability Act, HIPAA, which I think was enacted in 1996, if I'm correct. Basically says that medical information cannot be portable, cannot be shifted from one clinic to another without the consent of the individual, and that all medical information is private. And that's very important. It's an important kind of law to abide by, because we see it a lot in research that it's very easy to get information that is private information that's confidential. And obviously, with everything that's going on with the internet nowadays, a lot of our information is very susceptible to being put out there. So confidentiality is something that's extremely important and should be regarded as such when you're doing research. These ethical considerations may seem like they're very common sense, but not everybody follows these. People are following them more nowadays than they did 50 years ago, but still there's still some unethical research that's going on. So that was a little bit of a long-winded presentation, a little bit over an hour. I do apologize for that. But you have to understand that when you talk about study design and sampling methods, it's crucial that they're done correctly, because if not, then the data you collect doesn't have the kind of impact that it should. So if you have any questions about what we just talked about, what I discussed, please send me an email. And please send emails to spirerd@gmail.com, not to the LIU email, because I don't often check the LIU email. The spirerd@gmail.com is on the syllabus as well. So hope you enjoy your week. Happy spring, and I will be talking to you soon.